Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. Hi, Fabrizio. Arun, Nabil, can we have you online as well, please? All right, fantastic. All right, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this Fintelekt ABA webinar on the drug trafficking threat assessment and AML CFT considerations. We have over 1,200 people registered for the webinar today across Asia and a few other countries, which is, I think, a testament to the enormous interest in this particular topic. At first, I would like to welcome our speakers and panelists that are participating today. Fabrizio Fioroni, advisor, AML CFT at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, that is UNODC. He's based in the regional office for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, which is in Thailand, but he's actually joining us from Fiji today. So welcome, Fabrizio.
Thank you very much, Shirish.
Our other panelist is Nabil Dipatuan, who's the financial intelligence lead at UnionDigital Bank, based in Manila in the Philippines. Nabil, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Shirish. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks. And our last panelist is Arun Ajayagosh, who's a senior manager for financial crime compliance, AML and sanctions at Wall Street Exchange and is based in Dubai in the Middle East. Hi, Arun. Welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Shirish.
Fantastic. All right. So, in the webinar today, we are actually very lucky to have these expert speakers who will provide an insight into the recent trends and typologies in illicit activities involving drug trafficking. For those of you who I have not met before, either online or offline, my name is Shirish Pathak. I at Fintelekt, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. So for banks and financial institutions, it is actually very important to understand the risks and emerging typologies linked to drug trafficking and to build the appropriate levels of control into their AML compliance program. And not just banks, but also regulators. It is important for them to understand the subject as it will actually help them fine-tune red flag indicators and communicate this to the reporting entities or covered persons. And, I'm happy to see that we have a very large delegation from the Banco Central Filipinas and the AMLC Philippines, as well as PACCOR from the Philippines that is attending today. So thanks a lot for attending, amongst, of course, other regulators and FIUs around the region. A few announcements before we actually get into the webinar. One is, in the interest of time, I'm not going to actually read out the bios of all the speakers and panelists, but we have posted that their LinkedIn profiles into the chat box. So any of you who would like to look them up or connect with them, feel free to do so via their LinkedIn profiles. The format for the webinar today is we're going to first have a presentation for about 15 to 20 minutes by Fabrizio. That will be followed by a panel discussion amongst all of us. And finally, we'll move on to audience question and answer. So any of you who have questions, either during Fabrizio's presentation or during the panel discussion later, please keep posting it into the Q&A window, and I will take it up, time permitting, at the end of the webinar. For this webinar, we'll also be issuing participation certificates to all the attendees, and these will be emailed out to you within a week from today. In case any of you don't receive it for some reason, please let us know. The recording for the webinar today will also be available on the Fintelekt YouTube channel. So in case some of your colleagues missed it or you had to drop out midway, it will be available there. For those of you in the Philippines, we are running our face-to-face workshop on AML CTF risk assessment in Manila later this month on the 18th of July. We will post information about that in the chat box as well later. So all of you who have not yet registered for that, please follow the instructions in the chat and do register for it if possible. With that, let's now get on to the session by Fabrizio. Also very, while Fabrizio sort of gets his presentation up and running, a very sincere thanks to my colleagues at the Asian Bankers Association, especially Amador and Meg, for supporting us in this webinar. It's good to do these every month with you, and we hope to continue them. Okay, I've seen that Fabrizio has got his presentation online. So Fabrizio, thanks again for taking part today, and it's over to you.
You're welcome, Shirish, and thank you as well from my side. I would like really especially thank the Asian Bankers Association and the team in Fintelekt for inviting me on behalf of UNODC to make a presentation today, but also to participate in the panel discussion. It is very important for us at UNODC to address the issues related to money laundering and also a little bit of financing of terrorism when it comes to drugs trafficking. It's a pleasure for me to be connected with Arun and Nabil. I'm really pleased because they have a lot of expertise in the field. And I would like to really give a very good welcome and good morning, afternoon, wherever they are. It's a very good number of participants. So I'm going to skip the presentation on myself because I swear more or less my profile is reliable on LinkedIn. I think I put everything there. And what I'm going to discuss today, it's coming from the experience and the work that we do at UNODC, particularly in the regional office for Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. And I'm gonna discuss with you, as you see from the title of this presentation, on the analysis of the drug market. We will do a short analysis here to understand better using a little bit of statistics from the trafficking of heroin, methamphetamines, and cocaine, as we see it here in the region. And we will see something which is pretty much useful, which is about the resilience of organized crime groups who are behind the production and distribution of these illegal commodities. And we should take an opportunity from the recent problems we had with COVID, because it gave us a lot of lessons to be learned, and we can use it as a milestone to measure really how organized crime is working as a business. Because that's how actually they sustain their activities. And when we look at money laundering from organized crime and also including from drugs trafficking, we consider these criminal groups as business activities to understand how they operate. Because at the end of the day, what they do is that they produce profit, and they use similar concepts which are employed by normal companies, normal businesses. And we see this like their reliance on major pillars like having human resources available, having logistics that they can use for facilitating their market, their operations, and obviously having a good knowledge of understanding of the demand and supply within the market they work in. And obviously the reliance on the access to finances, which is the most important for us in terms of money laundering, to understand how these criminal groups are investing their profits and how they're laundering part of those profits for enjoying the luxury lifestyle. So it's important for us at UNODC to address these aspects because obviously being part of the United Nations, we contribute to our member states achieving obviously peace, security, respect of human rights, development, and so on. And obviously, as long as we have these kind forms of organized crime existence in the member states, obviously we cannot see development, we cannot see security or respect for human rights, which then obviously undermine peace within our planet. So going into the statistics, basically I would like to start with a little bit of consideration from the production of heroin or the opium poppy cultivation, as you see it in the slides. There are some considerations to do here because we see that resulting from the surveys that we have completed last year in Myanmar, we can see that the market of the production of opium for producing heroin is on the rise again. we saw the market like going down, the production, the farming in Myanmar going down since 2014. We didn't get statistics for 2016, but we see that after, or let's say at the end of COVID, and in conjunction also with some political major changes in Myanmar, now the production of opium for heroin is increasing again. Now, this might be a result of the normal fluctuation of the market of heroin production. We see that basically there has been an increase also between 2006 and 2014, and then going down. This might be a natural process of this market, but we need to consider that now the trend is going up. And unfortunately, we have already, let's say, reached the same levels that we had in 2011. So when we had good news, like the trend going down, now, unfortunately, we see that the situation is changing for the worst. And looking in details, we can also identify more or less in which regions or states within Myanmar this production has changed. And we see that there are different percentages here of increase of farming according to the different states. And unfortunately, this is coupled with a decrease in seizures of heroin in the region. Even though basically we clearly see that there is a major production going on at the moment, or at least until last year, but we can assume that the trend, it is still going up, knowing the fluctuation of the market. And as I said, the seizures of heroin in Southeast Asia and East Asia, unfortunately, has a negative trend until for the statistics that we had until 2020, which are not yet confirmed. But we see that basically you see in red color the seizures made for heroin made by the 6 Mekong countries, while the blue part is the share of seizures from other countries in the region, including East Asia as well. And you see that majority of seizures have been registered in the 6 Mekong countries, while probably there is not yet a mature understanding of the trend of the market in the other countries. We can see here in 2020 a total of heroin that was seized in the East and Southeast Asia amounted to around 11 tons, which is quite an important amount. 85% of which was seized in the 6 Mekong countries, and we noticed that there has been an increase in Thailand, obviously also because of the geographical position of Thailand being so close to Myanmar, but also Lao PDR, where also heroin is produced. The other illicit drugs that gives us a very good understanding of the market is methamphetamine. And we see that the supply continues to increase. This is based on the assumptions coming from the seizures that we see in the region. Also here, you see that in majority of seizures for the statistics that we have between 2011 and 2022, majority of seizures are done in Southeast Asia. You see that in light blue color, we have indicated the Southeast Asian countries' seizures, and in the darker blue color, you have the share of seizures from East Asian countries. And in 2021, in total, more than 171 tons of methamphetamines have been seized, and we had over 1 billion tablets of methamphetamines seized, which is the biggest amount that we ever recorded so far. For 2022, where we don't have yet the confirmed statistics, we see that there has been an increase in seizures in the Philippines, but also increases in other countries. Also, Myanmar has registered an increase in seizures, and most likely Thailand will confirm as well. But unfortunately, as you see, the share of the other East Asian countries here, it's decreasing. So this is also an alarming trend, because we don't assume that there is less consumption, but we can assume that there is less or decreasing attention probably by the authorities who are mandated to address these problems. If we look at the prioritization of addressing issues of in relation to methamphetamines, the difference between the situation in 2010 and the situation in 2021, basically we had information of methamphetamines as being a priority for mandated government agencies. This was only reported by a few countries in the region. You see Thailand, Cambodia, Laos PDR, Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. But then by 2021, basically it has become a major, a priority issue or priority drug of concern within the entire region. We missed the information from North Korea, but you see that this has become a real priority all over the region. And this is also shared at global level. Talking about the what we have observed, let's say before, between, and after COVID, is that methamphetamines basically has increased the, or let's say the market in terms of production and distribution of methamphetamines has started increasing already before COVID, because the price of methamphetamines, as you see in the screen here, where you have the cost of crystal methamphetamines on the left and methamphetamine tablets on the right. You see the example here for Brunei Darussalam, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, where the cost has decreased in dollars per gram, and the same is gone for methamphetamine tablets in Cambodia, Laos PDR, Myanmar, and Thailand. Obviously, this has resulted in more demands because obviously this type of drugs has become more affordable for a bigger number of consumers, which has led to an increasing production for these drugs as well. And then also during COVID, we saw that the price for methamphetamines has continued to decrease. You have here the situation for Cambodia, Malaysia, and Thailand, the difference between 2019 and 2020. And this again has contributed to make the market bigger for sure, which once again means that the production has increased and the profit for criminal organization also increased. This example here is relevant for crystal meth, and basically, yeah, I already mentioned the countries which are also reported here. And we have to consider that the purity of the meth that basically have been produced, even though the price went down, the purity has actually increased in some instances, but more than often remained stable. So that means that there has been probably a better availability or major availability of precursors or the chemicals which are needed for producing methamphetamines, and in this case, crystal methamphetamines. During COVID, we have noticed that basically the impact has been different between lower Mekong countries, you see listed here on the left side, and the maritime countries, where you see that basically there has been an increase of obviously seizures. Over here, we are talking about seizures, where you see the quantities and the percentage change from 2019 to 2020. And the only negative result was in Vietnam. And over here for the maritime countries in Southeast Asia, basically we see that there have been decreases in Indonesia and Philippines, and some increase Brunei Darussalam, Malaysia, and Singapore. But you should look also at the quantities that we are referring to, with very big seizures in 2020 for methamphetamines in Malaysia here. But you see that basically there were big seizures in Myanmar, Thailand, and also quite important Laos PDR, and an increasing trend in Cambodia, which basically, according to our researchers, apparently is becoming quite more often a location for production of methamphetamines. So you see here a little bit of examples of seizures that occurred in 2020. You see that we are talking about thousands of kilos. So we have tons of seizures through the region. And we noticed during COVID time, this is in 2020, we saw that basically there has been a decrease in amount of seizures that authorities were able to complete in the first half of the year. But then in the second part of the year, the seizures increased dramatically. Now, this obviously can have two different interpretations. We can think that obviously because of the more stringent measures that were put in place during COVID probably resulted in major identification of trafficking. But this can also mean that probably there has been a reduction of trafficking within the first half of 2020, so the initial part of COVID. But then probably in the second half of the year, probably the criminal organization found new ways for using their logistics to continue the production and trafficking. Another trend that we noticed during COVID time is about the trafficking of cocaine. The Pacific is a major corridor for moving cocaine from Southern American countries and also Central America, going to markets in Australia, New Zealand, but also in Southeast Asia and other Asian countries. And we see that there have been major seizures of cocaine, for example, in the Marshall Islands, nearly 650 kilos of cocaine basically have been seized here in this Pacific Island jurisdiction. There have been more than 600 kilos of cocaine seized in Papua New Guinea as well. And then in two different occasions, also important seizures of cocaine in Tonga, with one seizure where we don't have the quantity of the cocaine being seized in 2021, but the value reported was more than $1 million at the retail price. And there has been also another seizures of 14 kilos of cocaine, again in Tonga in 2021. And we see that in conjunction with this, we see that there is a trend in increasing trend in the use of also cocaine in the Pacific. Until a few years ago, it was only a corridor. So the Pacific Islands were being used only for logistical purposes. But nowadays, we see an increased use of cocaine and also increased involvement of local syndicates in the Pacific, which are facilitating the trafficking. And unfortunately, there is a lack of statistics related to money laundering cases associated with this trafficking. In very, very few cases, there have been reported charges for money laundering associated with these traffickings. Talking about money laundering, during COVID, we have observed what we actually knew about the fact that this drug trafficking, this market is mostly cash-based, particularly for at the retail operations, basically. And we saw that during COVID, again, when countries were implementing more restrictive measures, We saw, for example, in Australia, very high or actually record seizures of money in cash coming from drugs trafficking. In less than 6 weeks, basically in Australia, they seized the equivalent of $23 million in cash between November and December 2020. And then we have observed also that some entities which are operating in the Golden Triangle, which is relevant for the Mekong countries, particularly for Myanmar, Laos, PDR, and Thailand, where they border with each other, where there is also production of heroin and methamphetamines. Basically, we see that listed entities who are listed by the United States also for money laundering offenses related to drugs, they actually have been expanding their businesses, and they have been actually building new infrastructures which will provide more logistics for drug trafficking and money laundering as well. We have quite important challenges in the region. At the moment, we have 3 ASEAN countries listed by the Financial Action Task Force. Namely, we have Myanmar in the so-called blacklist, and then we have the Philippines and Vietnam, which recently was listed as well. This is an important factor not to be overlooked, because this means that these 3 countries, obviously, they have difficulties in addressing money laundering. And obviously, these kind of difficulties, they also facilitate the expansion or the sustainability activities, the sustainable activities for the criminal organizations. In general, despite the 3 countries who are listed, in general, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, what we observe as an international organization working with member states is that the AML and CFT mechanisms are still quite not effective. And this has obviously an impact also on the way that financial institutions, but the private sector in general, is required to basically identify, detect, and prevent that their system be misused by criminals for laundering proceeds. And this is because obviously there are expectations from the public sector for the private sector to be capable of identifying these issues, but when the AML CFT mechanism doesn't work properly, we observe that also the private sector has an impact, because obviously who works in the private sector is not in a position to receive proper feedbacks on the work that is being done. With this one, I would like to close my presentation, and I would like to give the floor back to Shirish for any possible questions also from the audience.
Thanks, Fabrizio, for that very, very insightful presentation. I think it has helped to sort of set a good context for this webinar, and also provide a lot of key information to the audience. Regarding questions, what we will do, Fabrizio, is we will take it up immediately after the panel discussion. We do have 2 questions which have come in, but we'll take it up after we do the panel. So we'll keep those on hold for the time being. Before we start the panel, I just wanted to run a quick audience poll. So can we have the audience poll up, please? So audience, this is a poll, a question for you. Have you filed an STR or SAR specifically related to a drug trafficking offense? Let me run it for a few seconds. And while we run the audience poll, there are a couple of announcements that I'd like to make. One is a copy of Fabrizio's presentation will be shared with the audience in due course over email. And also, since the webinar is running over capacity, we have started the live YouTube feed as well. So all of you who are logged into YouTube and would like to post any questions, please put that in the YouTube chat, and I will try and pick up some of the questions from there during our Q&A session as well. All right, I think maybe give Okay, we've closed the poll. All right, so I'm letting the panelists take a look at the poll answers for a bit, and we will, I'll ask for feedback while we are discussing in the panel. But I think the overall majority says that, most people have not yet filed an STR or an SAR related to a drug trafficking offense, right? Okay. With that, Nabil and Arun, may I request you to unmute so that we can start with the panel. And let me first kick this off by maybe posing a question to Nabil. So Nabil, there are significant challenges in identifying the actual underlying predicate offense in a transaction that appears suspicious. And often many crimes have, many different crimes have similar red flag indicators, and there also may be commingling of funds. So at an operational level, I mean, how can the AML analysts pinpoint transactions that involve illicit activity to be related to drug trafficking? And can you share your experiences on investigating such transactions and disambiguating the different typologies? So Nabil, would love to get your inputs on that, and then I'll move to Arun and Fabrizio for their inputs on this as well. And feel free to comment on the poll as well. Over to you, Nabil.
All right, sure. Thank you. So just before I start, usual caveat, anything I say today is my own opinion, not that of the company I'm currently connected with. So yes, I definitely agree with you, Shirish. Many crimes have similar red flags indicators, and in most cases are commingling, and this is really a challenge for analysts and investigators within the AML realm. In the case of the transnational crimes, you may not be able to, you may not be just looking at drug trafficking or narco trafficking, but also could be in combination with other transnational crimes such as human trafficking or illegal firearm trade. So I'd say one of the best way to empower your analysts within the operation is by exposing them to several or various types of trainings and workshop that would help them really pinpoint and recognize new emerging typologies or threats and the red flags indicators involved. So this could be in the form of, let's say, informal or internal training agreement, meaning within your firm with case studies, or you could also invest in partnering with reputable organization that provides the type of targeted training that the firm is needed. In my experience, though, drug-related transaction red flags indicators to watch out for when looking at transaction would be: one, transactions of an arrested, convicted suspect while in prison or whether after their arrest. So this is where your tool for adverse media screening, whether manual or automated or sometimes combination of both, will come into play. Similarly, those customers or beneficiaries that sends or receives funds from a person or entity subject of usually asset freeze, right? There are also some indicators such as beneficiary of funds located in an area where, but receive funds from different places in the Philippines. Again, I want to highlight that this may not be a lone red flag, but it could be a combination of most typologies involved with drug trafficking. And personally, I also experienced a recipient of large sum amount of money, whether it's international remittance or domestically funds involving minors or student. So that could also be one of your indicators to focus on. And ultimately, unusual transactions originating from jurisdictions or region with increased risk of drug trafficking. Yeah. So those are the common or typical red flags in operation. But keep in mind that these typologies are also evolving, and various red flags are emerging from time to time. So understanding your overall risk based on your customer risk, channels and the product and services you're offering really matters in assessing and providing controls and mitigating risk exposure to any forms of transnational crimes.
Right. Thanks, Nabil. Arun, can I have your comments on this question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Shirish. Yeah, I agree to what Nabil has said. When it comes to financial institutions, how they identify typology-specific transactions, primarily financial institutions rely on transaction monitoring systems, that generates customer alerts based on various rules and scenarios. So there are scenarios such as one to many or many to one. These are generally, indicative of suspicious transactions, but most of the time these scenarios could be one of the red flag indicators for multiple financial crime typologies. For example, many to one as an scenario originating from an high risk country known for terrorism funding, to a corridor like Iraq or Syria could be likely related to terrorism financing. At the same time, many to one transactions originating from Middle East to China could be commercial transactions. So depending upon the corridor, the typology can vary. So that is one thing that the analyst needs to look into while reviewing a set of alerts. And there are few limitations when it comes to transaction monitoring system generally that an FI has. For example, rule based alerts are less effective when it comes to identifying typology related transactions unless the typology characteristics are very specific. So when it comes to drug trafficking, the characteristics is not that specific as such, where you can have some scenario where you would directly get an alert and that this is related to drug trafficking. So this is one of the major challenges when it comes to investigating drug trafficking related transactions. So one approach where I feel which is more effective rather than a rule based transaction alert, it's an approach where you review the typology from an top down way, where you can strategically look into the transactions by understanding the corridor of concern. So for that, a financial institution can collect open source information related to specific typology, and can also utilize like what Nabil said, the individual names referred by law enforcement agencies who are convicted for a financial crime, so that you can understand the underlying transaction characteristics. And once you have an understanding of the corridor and as well as the transaction characteristics, the organization can also look into the previously identified transactions that the organization has reported with respect to a specific typology. So based on all these information, one could look into creating an specific analytical approach from the data, rather than reviewing an customer alert which is just concentrating on one customer and his transaction. This approach will give you an holistic view of a specific crime that is happening in a corridor, and you have a targeted set of data to start your analysis with. So once you have, maybe to give an example, and if an FI is assessing an human smuggling typology from Central America to the United States, as per open source, it says that a migrant journey takes up to 3 months to reach the US Mexico border, and the travel is primarily financed by travel expense of a migrant is primarily financed by the family members in the destination countries, and smugglers often charges high amount to cross the borders. So in this scenario, when you define an analytical approach, FI should look for high principal transactions sent and received by non-familial individuals within a span of 3 months, and look for many to many networks and focus on transactions that are received at the border provinces of Central America. So here the analytical approach is aligned with the open source information, and the initial data set is limited to transactions that likely exhibit human smuggling related transactions. So when it comes to drug trafficking, it is important to know the source, transit, and destination countries, and the type of drugs and the market prices, like what Fabrizio showed in his slides and in his presentation. The concentration that is happening within various countries, what type of the drug, what are the prices, how it has changed over the course of time, what was the price before COVID, and what is the current price after the COVID. So these market trends and fluctuations are certain things that needs to be kept in mind before analyzing the transactions. So now once you have a set of transactions based on the analytical approach, one could look for high value transactions to provinces or cities known for drug protection in the source countries. So with respect to drug trafficking, this is one way where you could narrow down your analysis. And one thing that we all should know, that there is no one size fit all analytic approach that can be utilized to find drug trafficking transactions. This is mainly because the value of drugs can vary according to the type of the drug, the amount, the place where you live, and the factors such as supply and demand.
Right. Thanks, Arun. So Arun and Nabil, thanks for your inputs on that question. So Fabrizio, we've heard from, let's say, the private sector, their point of view on this topic. We also saw in the poll that 53% of institutions have never filed an STR or SAR related to drug trafficking. And you mentioned in your presentation that yes, the public sector does have expectations of the private sector. So what is your advice to the private sector on this?
Yeah, my advice here is like, as it was already mentioned also by Arun, Nabil. First, we have to consider that there is not like an answer, no? There is not a formula that we can apply here to really understand whether it is drugs or other forms of crime. But what I suggest, first of all, because this is a market that is in principle, or let's say in large part cash-based, which means that there is, I think, a need for the private sector, especially financial institutions, in properly train also first-line officers, the counter officers, to understand the typology of clients or customers they deal with, because that gives an opportunity going outside of the typical monitoring of open source information. It gives an opportunity also to have better knowledge of the customers, what they're doing in the field first. Second, I would say that there is a need for building better relationship with the public sector. So the public and private sector partnership is very important here, because in the best case scenario, you can have financial institutions or other reporting entities identifying trends which might suggest that something suspicious is going on. It's very difficult what kind of crime is behind that. And early discussion with the public sector in that stage can facilitate the identification of drug traffickers, because then in that case, you should expect that the law enforcement agencies should have a better knowledge of what's going on in terms of organized crime that is dealing with drugs. But because of the increasing trend that we see in the production of chemical or synthetic drugs, so there is an assumption that these countries who are producing large amounts of methamphetamines are importing also large amounts of chemicals and precursors. So that's a field that should be taken into consideration by financial institutions by observing who is actually purchasing or importing, who is making payments for this kind of commodity, which are not necessarily illegal, but usually they are controlled or listed kind of chemicals that should be traveling with proper documentation. And that's where attention should be probably focused on.
Thanks, Fabrizio. I think, coming back to Arun and Nabil, we saw in the poll that 53% institutions have not filed reports, but obviously there are some who have been doing it. Now, if institutions have to fine-tune their AML monitoring systems better, right, to all the new typologies, to threats, to the new ideas that were shared, so as to generate more relevant alerts and in turn file more specific and useful STRs. What would your advice be on that? Maybe Arun, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, thanks, Shirish. Yeah, so fine tuning of the system is very critical, and to know the trends and typologies, it is very important that the FI first assess the trends and the patterns for existing typology, including the emerging typology. So one of the ways where FIs can achieve this is by having an intelligence collection program within the compliance that primarily focuses on collecting typology based information from reliable open sources. So this will actually allow the finance institution to keep informed on all developments with respect to a typology, and it will also enable to fine tune the thresholds in an effective way. uh, to give you an example, during initial phases of COVID, various countries imposed travel restrictions, which impacted migrant smuggling overall, and it's actually resulted in lesser smuggling activity. And at the same time, the smugglers charged higher amounts to smuggle during that period. So this information would ideally help the finance institution in fine tuning the thresholds for human smuggling typology. So again, this is specific to a typology where you could do an enhancement with respect to the thresholds. And something like drug trafficking, it is less likely that you can have an system or an alert where you can fine tune and do it. Another example would be where the names of individuals who were arrested by law enforcement agencies with respect to a specific typology. If the financial institution has that information, and the financial institution can look into the transaction conducted by that customer to see the trends in transaction and utilize that information to fine tune the system. So if you had a certain thresholds, but the recent data shows that the individuals who are arrested for a specific typology, the transaction trend is showing different levels of concentration, or the amounts are varying, then you could utilize that information to fine tune the system. Also, another information would be like what Nabil said earlier. The negative news screening is also critical, because from an organization perspective, every organization as part of sanction screening will have a batch screening process which runs all the customer names against various negative news. And if it results in any finding related to a customer who is part of a financial crime typology, what the FI could also utilize that information and assess the transaction to fine tune the system. And at last, the organization should also have a typology database where all the typology related transactions are added, so that while assessing any specific typology risk, the organization can right away look into the database to know the trends and patterns within the organization that will assist the organization in fine tuning the system. And moreover, the system should be flexible enough to modify the rules and scenarios. This is one of the challenges, I think, mostly financial institutions face, that if the system is hard coded, then it will result in engaging vendors, and it will delay the enhancements of rules.
Great, thanks, Arun. Nabil, moving the question over to you. Fine tuning the AML monitoring system. Is there anything incremental you would like to share over what Arun has said?
Sure. So the FIs definitely can perform various activities. Really depends on the immediate risk exposure. So the volume, the amount of tasks it needs to perform, conduct AML system in fine tuning. You usually start by monitoring your local regulators or FIU's advisories on the subject of new emerging threats and typologies. And then you use that to conduct your risk assessment to really identify new typologies and emerging threats in money laundering and terrorist financing. So this assessment ideally should be timely and relevant to your firm to help you understand the evolving risk and ensure your AML system is updated and remains effective. So the rules and the scenarios, including the parameters in place, can capture the newer threats. In addition to that, data analysis and continuous monitoring is equally important to regularly enhance the monitoring system and generate relevant alerts, because that's really what we want, so that we can have a high conversion rate in terms of STR or STAR, and ultimately do your testing and optimization activity. So start by testing that the testing should be performed in a manner that it is in the testing environment first. So if you're using or partner with vendor, like Arun said, it should have the flexibility to give you that environment prior to deployment in production. So this will then be followed by alert rules monitoring to further optimize performance.
Great, thanks, Nabil. Okay, let's quickly run another poll now. Can we have the second poll up? So this one is on role-specific training. Have you received role-specific training on identifying predicate crimes underlying the suspicious transaction alerts? So it'll be great if the audience can answer that. And while the audience is answering that, we had a question from the audience on from a member on YouTube, which is related to what Fabrizio mentioned, about the dual-use goods, right? And also you touched upon a bit on the enhanced monitoring. So how could you use the dual-use goods typology to make sure, whether a transaction is suspicious or not? So, Arun and Nabil, any specific advice on, dual-use good?
Yeah, so with respect to dual-use goods, I think finance institutions that are engaged in providing, corporate remittances generally tend to screen the invoice copies or the materials that a company is importing. So the payments related to that. So here in UAE, the supervisory authority has provided a tool or a website which provides all dual-use goods that are present, where the organization can incorporate that list to their monitoring and screening systems that enable the institution to identify dual-use goods and then take an appropriate action on whether to release the transaction or not.
Right. Nabil, any inputs on that?
Specific to dual-use goods, you would want to ideally have a payment screening system to hold off any transaction related to dual-use good. Scrutinize definitely the type of commodities they're working on, or technologies, if it's really dual-use good. Some of these are available by external searches, like in customs, to identify if this really a dual-use good, and tied it up to the overall profile of the customer. If it really commensurate with the activity, and if there's anything unusual and you feel it's suspicious, but you're not sure really what type of typologies, do not worry about that. Just file your STR or SAR, because that's the right thing to do anyway.
Right,
and
thanks,
let your FIU work on that.
Right. Thanks, Nabil. Okay, we have, while we're on the subject, we have one more question from Kiran Shah, who says, what typical typologies related to drug trafficking can help financial institutions to track them? Do you have any specific, let's say, top 2 or 3 typologies that you think are doing the rounds? What typical typologies related to drug trafficking should be tracked so that FIUs can identify these transactions?
Yeah, so typically, I mean, when it comes to drug trafficking, one of the main, concerns is like, one needs to understand what are the source, transit, and destination countries. So it is always better to do a corridor analysis, so that you understand that, if you are, for example, if you are operating in a corridor where you are seeing transactions outflows to Afghanistan, so you need to understand what kind of drug is produced in that country. Similarly, if any payments are going to China, you would expect that it could be fentanyl related transactions. So within drug trafficking, there is no standard or top three that you could mention. But yeah, depending upon the drug and the corridors, because one needs to understand that globally there are set of countries that are known for drug producing, and there are certain countries that are known for consumption of various drugs. So once you understand that, then you need to build around your understanding while you analyze a set of transactions. That, I think, that's the good starting point.
Right. Thanks, Arun. Nabil, anything to add to that?
No, I think Arun pretty much covered it all.
All right, great, thanks. Okay, we have 5 minutes left for the webinar, and before we sort of close, I know there are a lot of questions which are coming in, and we will try and get them addressed by the panelists offline and have the answers included in the takeaways document that we publish after the webinar is done. But before we end, Fabrizio, I would like to ask you, I mean, we all know that there are gaps, I think, in both the private sector as well as the public sector to an extent, but how are organizations like the UNODC actually contributing to both awareness generation and capacity building within the private sector, so that the private sector can, help combat this menace?
Yes, I would say that the major focus of the UNODC in general is usually on the government agencies, so providing technical assistance on them. Obviously, for the private sector, we have so many publications available, which are accessible for everyone, like the statistics that I have included in my presentations. They are all part of reporting researches that on a timely basis we report on our database and on our website, sorry, which is a very good, I think they are very good tools, because they provide an overview of the market that is going on also globally, not just for Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia. And that is a good way for raising awareness. And I would expect financial institutions and the private sector in general also to look at that kind of publications to better increase their knowledge. Now, when we provide capacity building or technical assistance to increase the capacities of countries, government agencies to better implement effective AML CFT mechanisms, we expect that then that is also reflected in the relationship within the FIUs usually, but also other government agencies for regulators with the private sector, also to transfer that kind of knowledge that they build. But other than that, I was saying that obviously we see very important gaps. Now, as I said in my presentation, the AML CFT mechanisms are not that much effective. And this has an impact on the work of the private sector, because all the discussions we had so far, like generating alerts, it's all based on knowledge, because without knowledge, it's very difficult to build algorithms or processes that can monitor the transactions. And that knowledge should come from cases investigated and prosecuted by the relevant agencies. Without that, this is actually what is missing. The knowledge is limited so far, especially on the typologies for laundering the illegal proceeds. Not much on the transactions for purchasing the goods now, because also there are now new technologies, virtual assets being used for purchasing drugs on the dark web, for example, but those are just transactions for purchasing the drugs or selling the drugs, not really the money laundering process. And we have to consider that there are professional money launderers as well, which are not involved in the trafficking or production of drugs. And obviously, identifying suspicious transactions related to drugs when professional money launderers are used is very complicated. That's why we cover also those aspects, and that's why we push on the public and private partnership, because that's the best way to communicate and increase knowledge for better identification of patterns.
Fantastic. Fabrizio, thank you so much for your inputs. Arun, Nabil, thank you so much for joining as panelists into this session. Very interesting, very useful, and all the operational insights that you have provided. I think in the interest of time, we need to close the webinar. We are at the end of time. But before we end, I would urge all of you watching to definitely visit the Fintelekt YouTube channel. We have all the webinar recordings on that. This one will also go on to that. For the audience who is attending today from the Philippines, if you're attending our workshop in Manila on the 18th of July, I look forward to meeting you there. And our next webinar with the ABA will be on the 3rd of August, and that's going to be on AML CFT risk assessment. So in case any of you cannot attend the Philippines face-to-face workshop, we will have a very short webinar also on the same topic on the 3rd of August. My sincere thanks to Asian Bankers Association, to Meg and Amador for supporting this webinar and for partnering with Fintelekt today. Again, Fabrizio, Arun, Nabil, fantastic meeting you. Thanks for joining, and look forward to meeting you personally soon.
Thank you, Shirish.
Thank you, Shirish.
All right, bye then. Audience, have a good day.
Bye.